Good morning. So, following on from the alternative funding discussion I had in our previous podcast, I'm sitting today with Nick Prattley from Swell. He's going to talk to us about another alternative funding solution when your business is looking to start or grow. And Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jemma.
So, let's get started straight into it. What is Swell?
So Swell, we're a innovation funding advisor. In a nutshell, for most businesses, their biggest challenge to growth and innovation is funding. We act as a advisor to innovative companies who are looking at broadening their cash flow horizon, or looking at seeking external investment to help them accelerate their growth and innovation. So in New Zealand, we've got this amazing, fantastic mindset of growing companies on the smell of an oily rag. So really sort of taking a number 8 wire approach, and often that involves reducing debt or equity dilution, and founders and directors and managers tend to get stuck in sort of boots and all. So that is a great mindset, but it also can limit the potential of many organizations' growth. So what a lot of businesses don't sort of realize, I guess, is that there are several alternative funding mechanisms available to grow and scale their innovative businesses without having to go and throw away a whole lot of equity too early. In NZ, we've got a number of innovation incentives, from grants to R&D incentives, which the government is really backing and getting behind. So we act really as an intermediary to help businesses access that funding.
So you touched on it briefly, but what types of funding are available?
Yeah, so in NZ, there's sort of 2 main streams of innovation funding. So one comes under the grant funding banner, and the other one is a relatively new incentive, which is called the R&D tax incentive. So I guess starting with grants, most people will be familiar with our main innovation funding body, which is Callaghan Innovation. So they're a fantastic organisation. They've been around for a number of decades now, and they've got 3 or 4 kind of core grant funding mechanisms, which really help early stage and sort of mid stage businesses to continue fueling their innovation funding. So the one that businesses might be familiar with are their research and development project grants. So in a nutshell, they fund a percentage of a business's project costs, especially early businesses who've sort of been conducting R&D perhaps for less than 2 years. And those grants are really designed to help companies build their R&D expertise and give them an opportunity to push the boundaries and uncover new scientific or technological knowledge. The sort of process really for Callaghan grants is that they're match funded. And so Callaghan put up to 40% of the project costs in, and there's usually a cap, which at the moment is around 370,000 of eligible spend. Can be a very, very useful tool for businesses to grow their early stage R&D. There's another couple as well. So there's a smaller grant for businesses who are perhaps just getting started. So it's literally called the Getting Started Grant, and that funds 40% of their sort of startup R&D costs up to 5,000. It's a one-off payment, really designed to sort of help launch R&D activities and remove some of that early financial risk, and help to navigate some of those early R&D roadblocks, I guess. Another couple of great tools are for really sort of tip of the sword, I guess, science or technology businesses. There are also grants to help fund R&D PhD students or master's students. So they can be, mission critical, I guess, for quite a few startups who are carrying out feasibility studies, or looking at bringing, research students on to validate their innovation. So those grants can fund up to 6 months of salary costs for those PhD or master's students. The big question we usually get is, what sort of sectors are those grants looking to fund?
That was my next question, actually, is who's this for?
Yeah, it's a really good one. So in New Zealand, we're pretty good at being, sector agnostic. So many people will be, familiar with the big sort of push on agri-tech in New Zealand over the last 5 or 10 years. And that's been, really successful. We've seen a number of high growth startup companies who have scaled really, really quickly and taken agri-tech platforms and solutions offshore. But we still remain fairly sector agnostic. So what does that mean? Anything to do with software science or engineering, where we're keen to sort of back and put money behind. There is a new initiative the government's looking at the moment, which is a broader digital transformation plan, and we'd expect to see some more grant funding come out the back of that for companies involved in digital technologies and scaling those businesses. But any business with a solution or an idea that's pushing the boundaries in a field of science or technology, they are absolutely in scope and eligible to consider these grants.
You must see some really cool stuff.
Yeah, we do. And look, we've got clients across all spectrums at all stages of development. And I think the great thing is, New Zealanders are typically humble, and we do work with that sort of smell of an oily rag approach. And when we see the level of innovation that's taking place in NZ, it really is world class. And we're renowned really highly offshore for the innovation that we can take to the world. So these funding opportunities and grants are sort of pretty primed to take that. The big one, I guess, that most businesses sort of should be considering to help them fund their innovation is the research and development tax incentive. So that's recently replaced the old Callaghan Growth Grant in 2020, which was a long-running tool that businesses use to receive quarterly payments to fund their R&D. That's now shifted into a tax incentive, and it provides 15 cents on the dollar, or 15% of R&D expenditure back into a company's pocket. So big questions we get asked on that is, early stage companies are often loss-making. They're not paying any corporation tax or not paying any tax. How does it benefit them? They can still take a cash credit, essentially, or they can choose to offset the benefit against their future losses. So cash is king for small companies, and to get that sort of credit of 15 cents on the dollar is quite appealing. Most the businesses we work with, some of them are only spending pretty modest amounts, but even 15 or 20,000 is a huge injection for those companies to get.
Totally, it's better off in your pocket than the government's or wherever else you've spent it. When have you seen people miss this opportunity?
Yeah, it's look, a lot of these incentives and grants, they do have deadlines. So with grant funding, they usually Callaghan or MPI, whoever the funder is, they publicise their deadlines pretty well, and they usually have between 1 and 3 funding calls per year. They vary on availability of the cash and basically when and how the government wants to spend that money. For the research and development tax incentive, that's a little clearer. So the deadline for most businesses in New Zealand that have a March year end or a March balance date, the submission deadline is the 7th of May. So for any companies who are considering looking at that for their March 2022 year, the deadline is 7 May. So a couple of months away. So enough time to look at it, but would suggest getting onto it pretty soon.
Yeah. And have you seen that those sorts of funding make big differences? What examples have you got?
Yeah, huge differences really. And look, for SMEs, the the strategically minded businesses think about this funding as essentially as another source of revenue or as another client. So does it take time and effort to access this funding? It can do, but just as it would if you were going out and carrying out BD to win new business. So where it helps a lot of businesses is to scale is hiring new employees. So often a grant or R&D tax benefit is enough to go out and hire another couple of employees. Now, whether you're a technology business that will enable you to scale and develop your solution faster, or whether you're at commercialization stage and that is a marketing or a business development function, it really does have the ability. For example, 100,000 of benefit or grant, the ROI can be easily 5 or 10 times that if it's spent and invested back into the business wisely. So the government really is getting behind these schemes. There's a $1 billion commitment to the R&D tax incentive alone, and the government has actually set out some targets. They want to boost R&D spending as a percentage of GDP from I think 1.3% as it is now to 2% within a decade. So might not mean a hell of a lot in terms of just the core numbers, but for small businesses, that means competitive advantage. It means hiring new employees. It means investing in new technologies, new hardware, and being able to subcontract out any advanced development work that perhaps they might not have in house. So huge benefits in terms of ability to scale and be competitive.
So what can people do to prepare for those ranges of funding?
Look, it's really about I guess two things. So one is shifting from an ad hoc approach to innovation funding to trying to develop an innovation funding strategy. So what we spend a fair bit of time on with our clients is trying to map out the innovation funding landscape, look at what's available, look at what's likely to align with their business. And then the second point, most businesses have these sort of latent R&D projects or ideas that they would love to get off the ground if they had the money. So putting together a bit of a roadmap of what those projects look like, so when we can align the right funding opportunities to essentially help grow and build those projects. So it probably comes down to a lot of businesses of taking it seriously. I know from speaking to a few clients, they often spend years kind of looking over the fence at their competitors who seem to be accessing endless pots of grant money and R&D incentives, and sort of wondering why they're not able to benefit as well. And really, it comes down to having a plan, having a strategy, and then being proactive in terms of actually applying for that funding. If you don't apply, there's no chance of winning, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask next how long it takes, but it's sort of a rolling thing, isn't it? You build it into your strategy, and then you keep your eye on upcoming dates and upcoming funding opportunities. And it's sort of once you've built it into your psyche, you're actually just always working toward the next one.
Very much so, yeah. And that's what I mean about having a plan and having a strategy. As a rule of thumb, if you leave it until the grant is announced, or you leave it to a few weeks before the application deadline, pretty low chance of success, or pretty low chance of actually winning a grant bid. Some large companies, the sort of Fisher and Paykel's of this world have teams of people who are responsible for putting together grant application bids. No secret that they've been very successful in receiving government money in the last few years, and obviously testament to where they're at these days. But for small businesses who have small teams, any SME will know that usually incredibly time poor, and spending what is often a considerable amount of time, or can be a lot of time, on grant applications or R&D incentive applications. Doing that internally is not a great use of time. Speaking to an advisor or speaking to someone who can essentially outsource that work to, usually hugely increases their chance of being successful. and their net benefit is usually a lot higher than if they'd tried to look at that internally. So as with anything, there's a cost benefit analysis, but we usually phrase it with businesses to look at it as an extra income or extra revenue stream, and should be managed as any client would be who's generating that revenue for the business.
It resonated with me when you said that it's kind of comparable to a BDM function. You're just working on this, expecting to bring funding in that way. That's another business function to get that cash coming in. So that makes it pretty easy to understand.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
At what point are businesses no longer eligible for the government support?
Yep. So with grants, some of them end after a business has been carrying out R&D, for example, for 2 years. So unsurprisingly, I guess the government's focus tends to be on those early stage businesses and really giving them a hand up and trying to accelerate their sort of growth from early stage. That's not to say that there aren't grants available for mid or larger scale companies to help them commercialize or demonstrate their technology. So, for example, MPI has a great grant scheme called the SFFF, which is Sustainable Food and Fibre Futures. So those grants are up to 5 million a year for larger project partnerships. And that might be 2 or 3 businesses getting together in a consortium, looking to invest in or develop advanced materials or textiles. So that they do vary. It is a sort of case-by-case basis, but usually for early-stage businesses or who have a revenue cap, for example, of could be 2 million or 5 million, or in some cases much less than that. The R&D tax incentive is an open call, so that'll be an annual incentive that businesses can access. The only cap on that is for businesses who have R&D spend of 120 million per year, which obviously we don't have too many of those in New Zealand. And the entry point is a minimum spend of 50,000 per year. So one sort of full-time salary, I guess, of an R&D employee.
So then it's really available to the regular small business right through to the LanzaTechs and Rocket Labs of New Zealand.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to sort of expand on that, there is a misconception, I think, with a lot of these incentives that the bar is set really, really high, and indeed you do have to be a sort of Rocket Lab or have people in lab coats staring through microscopes, and although the purpose is to accelerate I guess core innovation and things that do push the boundaries in science and technology, the bar is often not as out of reach for businesses as they think. So the scope of activities is quite broad. The definition of R&D is quite broad as well. So the best thing to do if you think that you're doing something clever or novel or unique is look at the criteria, look at the guidance, or speak to an advisor, speak to us, and we can make an assessment of what you're doing and whether that's likely to be eligible for any of these incentives.
Yeah, that's really exciting. We do business loans, but we're often seeing people in their early phase of their business where they're excited about their idea and their innovation, and a loan is not always a great fit, and I think you touched on it when you said about the number 8 why. That's so typical. People just want to knuckle down, get stuff done, bear the brunt of it themselves. And, especially people often I find quite reluctant to give up equity, and so they're trying to do all the things and be all the things. Whereas, asking the right questions and talking to the right people can actually propel your business that much faster when you know where to look.
Yeah, and look, it can be, this funding can be used and is often used hand in hand with debt and equity. And indeed, having grants or having R&D tax incentive revenue or income coming through, as essentially it is actually a great signal to investors or even to lenders that you have explored all those other options. I know, that the first maybe not the first thing, but certainly a question that a lender, you for example, and investors would ask is, what other avenues of funding have you explored as a business? And if you can demonstrate that you have been applying for grants and that you opt into the R&D tax incentive, for example, that acts as a really positive signal, which will enable to more successfully attract that lending or investment.
Yeah, because you've kind of established yourself as someone professional, polished, and ready to go. If the government's looking at you, going, "Yeah, we're going to support you here."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think that Swell and Nick provide a really, really excellent option for people who are starting and growing businesses, and in a really dynamic and thoughtful way. So I'm going to leave some contact information for Nick, so that if you've got questions about how it might apply for your situation, you can reach out to him directly and get that conversation started.
Great. Thanks, Jemma. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time.